I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video what we're going to do is to experiment with Scale Quantize. Now we know about quantize, it helps put things in time. Well, what Scale Quantize does is to apply the same kind of logic to pitch. In other words, fixing pitch around a particular point. We'll see exactly how that works in a little while. What I've done is to build a little backing track with the help of the Skyline Masher live loop session. So if you want to experiment with exactly these sounds, you can. It's in that particular live loop session. I've stripped a few things out, and what we've got left is this. Okay, so to this very chilled sort of backing track, what I want to do is to find a little hook, something that's going to play on this sound that I've set up called Deep Space Pluck, which again is a library sound. So if you want to go and find it, you'll find it in synths and leads, I think. Okay, so anyway, it's this sound called Dark Space Pluck, and it sounds like this. So, in other words, a dark space pluck, exactly as its name suggests. Okay, now, normally what we would do would be to sort of experiment, play around with ideas, and look for hooks maybe to go against backing tracks like this in regular ways. We might try some different things out and sort of alight on a particular thing that we like. But sometimes it's nice to go looking for something a little bit random. And this is definitely a sort of going to be a kind of more creative, let's just see where we go with this kind of a video in terms of finding the potential for a little hook. So what I'm going to do is to actually play a chromatic scale in my left hand. And at the same time, I'm going to play a descending chromatic scale in my right hand, which is going to come down, and we're going to alternate the notes between those two things. Now, what I've already done is to find out that my track is in G. And the way that I've done that isn't by doing anything particularly experimental or anything particularly scientific, I should say. I've just played the track and just played some notes until I've discovered the note G fits nicely with it. So I've established it's in G, and what I'm going to do is to solo this, and I'm literally going to put in that scale that I mentioned. Okay, not bad. This nice little shape here has emerged as the notes kind of converge. And what I'm going to do is to select all of them, and I'm going to quantize them in 16th notes, and hopefully we get this perfect timing pattern. What I'm also going to do is I'm just going to fix their dynamics so they're all the same volume, and I'm going to make them all a little bit louder from a velocity perspective. And having done that, if I press Control and N, I'm going to fix those velocities in place so that they're all exactly the same. Okay, so that sounds like this. And with the backing track, it sounds like this. Okay, now this is not the hook that I want to use for this particular track. But the reason why I've played this pattern is because what I want is every single chromatic note within the scale to be represented in the notes that I've played. In other words, I want G, but I also want G sharp and A sharp, and so on and so forth. And I've got those both coming up from the bottom and coming down from the top. Yes. Okay, so what I've got is this kind of hairpin shape, and we've got every single chromatic note within the scale represented. Now then, I've done that on purpose because what I want to do is to use Scale Quantize, and that is here. Now, if I select these notes again, what I have a chance to do is to quantize them from a pitching perspective rather than a rhythmic one. So rather than the regular rhythmic quantize that we associate that word with, instead what we're going to do is we're going to fix these notes around a particular tuning scale. Now then, let's start with something really straightforward. If I was to come, let's say, to the chromatic scale and select this option, nothing will change, because effectively what we're doing is we're saying, right, all of the scale quantize, all of the chromatic scale is available to be quantized, and so as a result, every single semitone is available. Nothing changes. But if what I was to do was to say, okay, actually what I want to do is to use the major scale, only the notes of G major would be used. Why G? Well, I've selected G as the scale. So now, instead of an F natural, which is not part of the G major scale, anything that was an F natural has got to move somewhere else. And the same thing is going to be true of, let's say, D sharp and C sharp. All of the notes that don't exist in the G major scale are now left out of this pattern. And so now it sounds like this. Much happier. Okay, so let's instead select maybe a different type of scale. This time I'm going to go for the natural minor. The notes move a little bit. Tell you what, the end of that's quite nice, isn't it? I'm immediately thinking about hooks and how I might choose to use this idea and find little bits of something that might work nicely as a hook. And the very end of that, quite like that. Okay, so I'm going to keep that in mind. And what we can do is to look through some of the other scales that are available. Now, some of these, particularly if you study music theory, will immediately probably speak to you. So this idea of a major scale and a natural minor, and obviously we've looked at chromatic as well. But what we can also do is to get into various other scales, including things like the minor pentatonic. Now, what this is effectively going to do is to choose the pentatonic scale, which is a series of 5 notes, and effectively it's going to sort of put those around the minor version of that scale. Okay, so loads of notes are now being omitted. Rather than the sort of 7 notes that we might get from a major or a minor scale, we're effectively restricted to just 5 instead, which is why we get this gung 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 right on the end. All 3 of those notes have just become the same pitch. Now, what becomes really interesting when you start playing with Scale Quantize is that you'll be introduced to not just scales, but also modes. Now, modes are really interesting, and I'm going to slightly bang the drum for this a little bit. It matters to me a lot that we learn a little bit of music theory alongside the technological stuff that we do when we're working with music production. It really matters. Effectively, rhythms, melodies, chords, all of the sort of harmonic stuff as well that exists within pieces of music, they're the currency of music. They are the lifeblood, really, of the music that we write. And if we're restricted in terms of our knowledge of those things, then effectively our music is going to be limited by those too. So this is a great place to experiment, but it's also going to teach you some of the most important stuff you're going to learn, which is what are the notes that exist within particular scales. I'll get off my soapbox now, I promise. But nevertheless, I think it's really worth diving in and learning some of this. So what exactly are modes? Okay, well, let's come out of here for a moment and just have a little music theory lesson. If I play a C major scale and I start on C, you can see that I'm only playing the white notes. Those are the notes of the C major scale, all of the white notes that exist here. Now, if I was to start and play the same scale, but I was to start on D instead, but I was only still to play white notes, the relationship between those notes would be different. Now that's called the Dorian mode. Effectively, what we've got now is a C major scale that starts on D. And actually, it sounds more like D minor than it does C major because the 3 notes of a D minor chord exist in the Dorian scale. And there is a mode that starts on every single key. So for example, if I was to start a mode that started on an E, rather than a whole tone step, instead, we'd end up with a semitone step at that point. And effectively, all of the modes give us a sort of different foundation for the sorts of melodies that we can write. And we can experiment with all of them here. Having selected the note that we want to start on, we can effectively jump in here and we can learn about different modes. So for example, if I was to select klezmer, which is here, that's even nicer now, that little hook at the end, because we've got that little minor 2, these semitone steps here at the end rather than a major 2. And what we can also do is to experiment with scales from different parts of the world. So for example, this Southeast Asian sort of option here is going to change things considerably. That's really nice. You always know when something's really nice because I'll whisper it. Okay, I really like the end of that. Now then, do I want my melody to contain all of the notes that I've played in this kind of weird, chaotic sort of chromatic shape that I've created in the first place? Well, no, not necessarily. What I could do at this point, but I keep coming back to this section at the end, which I really like. So what we could do would be to say, okay, I don't want a hook that's made up of a whole sort of bar and a half. What I want to do instead is to get rid of all of this and maybe experiment with just this section at the end. I'm going to just come back here and just see what happens if I do that. Okay, let's put that back into the track. Okay, so out of nowhere, what I've got is this little hook now, which sort of started life as one thing and has become something completely different. Now, by applying Scale Quantize, unexpected things will happen. And what you need to do is to keep your ears open to the little bits of those things that you like. And of course, you can then get rid of the rest. But that's a really interesting way of saying, okay, well, what I want to do is to experiment with what happens when effectively a different collection of notes or combination of scales is applied to the notes that I play, and you never know, something absolutely great may spring out of it.